The story of methamphetamine begins not in a clandestine laboratory or on a darkened street corner, but in the pristine environment of a Japanese pharmaceutical laboratory in 1893. A chemist named Nagai Nagayoshi was working with a plant that had been used in traditional Chinese medicine for thousands of years, the ephedra plant known as ma huang. From this ancient botanical remedy, Nagayoshi successfully isolated and crystallized a compound that would eventually become known as ephedrine. His work represented the intersection of traditional knowledge and modern chemistry, a bridge between ancient healing practices and the scientific revolution that was transforming medicine at the turn of the 20th century. But the true birth of methamphetamine as we know it today came several years later, in 1919, when another Japanese chemist named Akira Ogata took Nagayoshi's work one step further. Using a reduction process involving red phosphorus and iodine, Ogata synthesized methamphetamine hydrochloride, creating the first crystalline form of the drug. This was a purer, more potent version of the stimulant, and it could be produced more easily than its predecessor. Ogata's synthesis method was remarkably efficient, and it would later become the basis for countless illicit manufacturing operations around the world, though at the time his intentions were purely pharmaceutical and scientific. In the years that followed, methamphetamine remained largely confined to research laboratories and pharmaceutical companies. Scientists were intrigued by its powerful stimulant properties, which far exceeded those of other compounds available at the time. The drug seemed to banish fatigue, increase alertness, suppress appetite, and create feelings of euphoria and confidence. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, pharmaceutical companies in both Japan and Germany began to recognize the commercial potential of this remarkable stimulant. In Germany, the pharmaceutical company Temmler-Werke began marketing methamphetamine under the brand name Pervitin in 1938. It was sold over the counter without prescription, marketed as a miracle drug that could help with everything from depression to low energy, from weight loss to improving concentration and performance. The German public embraced Pervitin with enthusiasm that seems shocking by today's standards. Housewives took it to keep up with their demanding schedules, students used it to study through the night, and workers consumed it to increase their productivity. The drug was even marketed in chocolate form, making it accessible and appealing to a broad demographic. For a brief period, methamphetamine was simply seen as a wonder drug, a technological advancement that allowed humans to transcend their natural limitations. There was little awareness of the potential for addiction or the devastating long-term consequences of regular use. The immediate effects were so compelling and the drug so new that society had not yet had time to witness the darker trajectory that chronic methamphetamine use would inevitably follow. But it was during World War II that methamphetamine truly revealed both its power and its danger on a massive scale. The German military, always seeking advantages in warfare, quickly recognized that Pervitin could transform their soldiers into superhuman fighting machines. Beginning in 1939, the Wehrmacht began distributing methamphetamine tablets to troops on a scale never before seen. Soldiers were given the pills to help them march longer distances, stay alert during extended combat operations, and overcome the natural fear and exhaustion that came with warfare. The drug was particularly useful during the Blitzkrieg campaigns, where speed and endurance were paramount to the German strategy of rapid, overwhelming assault. Tens of millions of Pervitin tablets were distributed to German forces during the war. Tank crews used it to drive for days without rest. Pilots consumed it to maintain focus during long missions, and infantry soldiers relied on it to keep fighting when their bodies should have collapsed from exhaustion. The drug became so integral to German military operations that some historians have argued the early German successes in the war were partly attributable to their widespread use of methamphetamine. Soldiers wrote letters home describing the drug's effects, explaining how it made them feel invincible, tireless, and fearless. One soldier wrote to his family requesting more Pervitin be sent in care packages, describing it as essential as ammunition. However, the German military eventually began to recognize the severe problems associated with methamphetamine use. Soldiers were experiencing psychotic episodes, cardiovascular problems, and severe addiction. When supplies ran low or were cut off, troops would experience devastating withdrawal symptoms that left them unable to function. Men who had been fearless warriors while on the drug became anxious, depressed, and physically ill when deprived of it. By 1940, the German military began to restrict its use, though it never disappeared entirely from the Wehrmacht's supply chain. Hitler himself became one of the most famous methamphetamine users of the era, receiving regular injections from his personal physician, Theodor Morell, who administered a cocktail of drugs that included methamphetamine under the brand name Eucadal. Meanwhile, other nations involved in the war were conducting their own experiments with amphetamines and methamphetamine. The British military issued amphetamine tablets to soldiers and pilots, though generally in more controlled quantities than the Germans. American forces also used amphetamines, particularly among bomber crews flying long missions over Europe and the Pacific. The Japanese military, drawing on their country's pioneering work in methamphetamine synthesis, provided the drug extensively to their troops, pilots, and kamikaze pilots who needed to overcome their natural survival instincts. These pilots were often given high doses of methamphetamine before their suicide missions, helping them maintain focus and suppress fear as they flew their aircraft into enemy ships. When the war ended in 1945, the world was left with massive stockpiles of methamphetamine and millions of people who had been exposed to its effects. In Japan, the post-war period saw an explosion of methamphetamine use among the civilian population. Military supplies of the drug flooded the black market, and with the country devastated by war, struggling with poverty and uncertainty, many Japanese citizens turned to methamphetamine as an escape and a way to cope with the overwhelming challenges of reconstruction. By 1954, Japan was experiencing what would later be termed the first major methamphetamine epidemic in modern history, with an estimated 500,000 to 2 million users. The Japanese government responded with strict laws, aggressive enforcement, and public health campaigns, eventually bringing the epidemic under control by the late 1950s. In the United States during the post-war years, methamphetamine and other amphetamines were legally manufactured by pharmaceutical companies and widely prescribed by doctors. The drugs were marketed under various brand names for treating depression, obesity, narcolepsy, and attention disorders. Benzedrine inhalers, which contained amphetamine, were available over the counter and were often abused by people seeking the drug's stimulant effects. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, amphetamines and methamphetamine were remarkably common in American society. Truck drivers used them to stay awake during long hauls, students took them to study for exams, housewives consumed diet pills containing amphetamines to lose weight, and professionals used them to maintain energy and focus in demanding careers. The Beat Generation writers of the 1950s, including Jack Kerouac, famously used amphetamines to fuel marathon writing sessions. Kerouac reportedly wrote his novel On the Road during a 3-week amphetamine-fueled session, typing continuously on a single roll of paper. The drug was seen by many in the counterculture as a tool for expanding consciousness and enhancing creativity, though this perception would gradually shift as the darker consequences of amphetamine abuse became increasingly apparent. Athletes also began using amphetamines for performance enhancement, a practice that would eventually lead to drug testing programs in professional sports. During the 1960s, as America's counterculture movement grew, so did recreational drug use of all kinds, including methamphetamine. The drug became particularly popular in the emerging biker subculture, where outlaw motorcycle clubs began to manufacture and distribute methamphetamine as a source of income and as a drug that fit their lifestyle of long-distance riding and rebellious independence. This was the beginning of the association between motorcycle clubs and methamphetamine that would persist for decades. These early producers used relatively simple chemistry and readily available materials to manufacture the drug, establishing networks that would eventually evolve into sophisticated criminal enterprises. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the American government and medical community were beginning to recognize the serious public health problems associated with amphetamine and methamphetamine abuse. Reports of addiction, psychosis, violence, and other severe consequences were accumulating. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act classified methamphetamine as a Schedule II drug, meaning it was recognized as having high potential for abuse but still had accepted medical uses. Pharmaceutical production was drastically reduced, and prescriptions became much more tightly controlled. This legal crackdown had the intended effect of reducing pharmaceutical amphetamine abuse, but it also had an unintended consequence. It created a vacuum in the market that would be filled by illegal manufacturers. The 1970s and 80s saw the rise of domestic clandestine methamphetamine laboratories across the United States. These operations ranged from small-scale producers cooking drugs in home kitchens and garages to larger operations run by organized crime groups. The synthesis methods were relatively simple compared to other drugs, requiring no difficult-to-obtain plants or complex equipment. The precursor chemicals needed to manufacture methamphetamine were available through legitimate chemical supply companies, at least initially. Producers used what became known as the ephedrine or pseudoephedrine reduction method, obtaining these precursors from over-the-counter medications like cold and allergy pills. During this period, methamphetamine was particularly prevalent in rural areas and small towns, especially in the western United States. The drug appealed to people working in agriculture, logging, and other physically demanding industries where the stimulant effects could help workers endure long hours of hard labor. It was also relatively inexpensive compared to cocaine, making it accessible to working-class users. The manufacturing of methamphetamine became an economic opportunity for people in rural areas where traditional industries were declining and unemployment was high. Making meth offered a way to earn substantial income with relatively little initial investment. But the real transformation of the methamphetamine problem came in the 1990s with the introduction of a new, more efficient synthesis method and the involvement of Mexican drug trafficking organizations. A criminal named Jesus Amezcua Contreras, along with his brothers, operating from Guadalajara, Mexico, recognized the enormous profit potential in methamphetamine. They established connections with chemical companies in India, China, and other countries to import bulk quantities of ephedrine and pseudoephedrine. With access to precursor chemicals by the ton rather than the small quantities available to domestic cooks, the Amezcua organization could produce methamphetamine on an industrial scale. Mexican trafficking organizations brought unprecedented sophistication to methamphetamine production. They established super labs capable of producing hundreds of pounds of methamphetamine in a single production run, using chemists with formal training and equipment that rivaled legitimate pharmaceutical operations. The drug they produced was often of higher purity than the methamphetamine made by small-scale domestic producers, and they could sell it at lower prices due to their economies of scale. They utilized the same smuggling routes and distribution networks they had established for cocaine and heroin, flooding American markets with methamphetamine in quantities that had never been seen before. The late 1990s and early 2000s saw methamphetamine use spread beyond its traditional strongholds in rural western states to communities across the entire country. The drug reached suburbs and cities, affecting diverse populations from various socio-economic backgrounds. The profile of the typical methamphetamine user became harder to define as the drug cut across demographic lines. While the stereotype of the rural white user persisted, the reality was that people of all races, educational backgrounds, and economic situations were using methamphetamine. One of the most insidious aspects of methamphetamine compared to many other drugs is the particular severity and nature of its effects on the human body and mind. The drug works primarily by causing a massive release of dopamine in the brain, creating intense feelings of pleasure, energy, and euphoria. However, with repeated use, the brain's dopamine system becomes fundamentally damaged. Users develop tolerance, requiring larger and larger doses to achieve the same effects. The natural production and reuptake of dopamine becomes impaired, meaning that without the drug, users feel profoundly depressed, fatigued, and unable to experience pleasure from normal activities. This neurological damage can persist for months or even years after someone stops using methamphetamine. The physical effects of chronic methamphetamine use are equally devastating and highly visible. The drug suppresses appetite, leading to severe malnutrition and dramatic weight loss. It causes severe dental problems, leading to what has been termed meth mouth, where teeth decay rapidly and fall out. This dental destruction occurs due to a combination of factors: dry mouth caused by the drug, which reduces the protective saliva that normally fights bacteria, grinding and clenching of teeth, poor hygiene habits, consumption of sugary drinks while high, and the direct toxic effects of the chemicals in the drug. Users often develop skin problems, particularly sores and lesions caused by obsessive picking and scratching, sometimes due to hallucinations of insects crawling under the skin, a condition known as formication. The cardiovascular system suffers tremendously under methamphetamine use. The drug causes rapid heartbeat, increased blood pressure, and constriction of blood vessels. Chronic use leads to increased risk of heart attack and stroke, even in young users. Blood vessels in the brain can be damaged, leading to cognitive impairments that affect memory, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Studies have shown structural changes in the brains of chronic methamphetamine users, particularly in areas associated with emotion and memory. Some of these changes appear to be partially reversible with long-term abstinence, but some damage may be permanent. Methamphetamine psychosis is another particularly frightening consequence of use. With prolonged use or high doses, users can experience severe paranoia, auditory and visual hallucinations, and delusional thinking. These psychotic symptoms can be indistinguishable from schizophrenia and can persist for months after drug use has stopped. Users experiencing methamphetamine psychosis may become violent, either because they feel threatened by imagined persecutors or because their hallucinations command them to act aggressively. This has led to tragic incidents of violence against family members, law enforcement, and innocent bystanders. The social consequences of the methamphetamine epidemic have been profound and widespread. Children have been particularly victimized by the spread of methamphetamine use. When parents become addicted to the drug, their ability to care for their children is severely compromised. Child Protective Services agencies across the country have reported dramatic increases in caseloads, with methamphetamine cited as a primary factor in removals of children from homes. Children have been found living in homes where methamphetamine was being manufactured, exposing them to toxic chemicals and the risk of explosions and fires. Many children have been neglected, abused, or abandoned by parents consumed by addiction. Law enforcement agencies, particularly in rural areas, found themselves overwhelmed by the methamphetamine problem. Small police departments with limited resources struggled to deal with the increasing number of clandestine laboratories, thefts of precursor chemicals, and crimes committed by addicts to support their habits. Methamphetamine labs pose unique dangers to law enforcement and emergency responders. The chemicals used in production are toxic, corrosive, and highly flammable. Explosions and fires from makeshift laboratories have killed and injured producers, first responders, and innocent neighbors. The toxic waste produced by methamphetamine manufacturing contaminates properties, sometimes making them uninhabitable without expensive remediation. In response to the methamphetamine crisis, governments at federal, state, and local levels implemented various strategies. One of the most significant approaches was restricting access to precursor chemicals, particularly pseudoephedrine, which is found in many over-the-counter cold medications. States began passing laws requiring these medications to be kept behind pharmacy counters, limiting the quantities that could be purchased, and requiring identification and signature for purchase. These laws were compiled into databases to prevent smurfing, the practice of visiting multiple stores to purchase large quantities of pseudoephedrine. The Federal Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act of 2005 imposed similar restrictions nationwide. These precursor control measures did have significant effects on domestic methamphetamine production. The number of small-scale meth labs discovered by law enforcement decreased substantially after these laws were implemented. However, the measures did not eliminate the methamphetamine problem. They simply shifted production even more heavily toward Mexican trafficking organizations, which continue to have access to industrial quantities of precursor chemicals through international sources. In fact, the purity and availability of methamphetamine in the United States actually increased in the years following precursor restrictions, as Mexican superlabs filled the gap left by domestic producers. The Mexican cartels also developed new production methods that were less dependent on pseudoephedrine. They began using a method called P2P synthesis, which uses different precursor chemicals, including phenylacetone. This method produces a different form of methamphetamine that includes both D-methamphetamine and L-methamphetamine isomers, whereas the pseudoephedrine method produces primarily D-methamphetamine, which is more potent. However, by using highly pure precursors and skilled chemists, Mexican producers created P2P methamphetamine that was still extremely potent. This shift in synthesis methods represented the adaptability and sophistication of the criminal organizations involved in methamphetamine trafficking. Treatment for methamphetamine addiction has proven challenging. Unlike opioid addiction, for which there are FDA-approved medication-assisted treatments like methadone and buprenorphine, there are no equivalent pharmaceutical interventions for methamphetamine. Treatment relies primarily on behavioral therapies, including cognitive behavioral therapy, contingency management, and support groups. The neurological damage caused by chronic methamphetamine use means that recovery is often slow and difficult. The profound depression and anhedonia that users experience in early abstinence leads to high relapse rates. Users report that nothing provides pleasure during the early stages of recovery, and the temptation to use methamphetamine again just to feel normal is overwhelming. Despite these challenges, recovery is possible, and many former methamphetamine users have successfully rebuilt their lives. Long-term residential treatment programs have shown some success, particularly when they address not just the addiction, but also the underlying trauma, mental health issues, and social circumstances that contributed to drug use. Peer support programs and recovery communities provide ongoing support that is crucial for maintaining long-term sobriety. As understanding of methamphetamine's effects on the brain has grown, treatment approaches have become more sophisticated, though success rates remain lower than treatment providers would hope. The methamphetamine epidemic has also highlighted broader issues in society, including the opioid crisis, economic inequality, social isolation, and the challenges of rural healthcare and economic development. Many researchers and public health experts note that methamphetamine use, like other substance abuse, is often a symptom of deeper problems. People turn to drugs like methamphetamine as a way to cope with poverty, unemployment, trauma, mental illness, and lack of opportunity. Addressing the methamphetamine problem comprehensively requires not just law enforcement and treatment, but also social and economic policies that address these root causes. In recent years, the methamphetamine problem in the United States has become intertwined with the opioid epidemic in concerning ways. Many people who became addicted to opioids, particularly fentanyl, have also begun using methamphetamine. Sometimes this is because methamphetamine is more available or less expensive than their preferred drug. Sometimes users intentionally combine the drugs, a practice called speedballing, where the stimulant effects of methamphetamine counteract the sedating effects of opioids, allowing users to achieve a different kind of high. This polysubstance use complicates both treatment and harm reduction efforts and has led to increasing numbers of overdose deaths involving both drug types. The contemporary methamphetamine landscape is dominated by Mexican trafficking organizations, particularly the Sinaloa Cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. These groups have refined production to an extraordinary degree, producing methamphetamine of remarkable purity at very low cost. They have established distribution networks that reach into virtually every American community, using a combination of traditional smuggling methods across the southwestern border and increasingly sophisticated operations that include hidden compartments in commercial trucks, tunnels, catapults, drones, and even ultralight aircraft. The sheer volume of methamphetamine being produced and trafficked is staggering, with individual seizures sometimes exceeding thousands of pounds of pure drug. Law enforcement has adapted to these new challenges with enhanced investigative techniques, improved intelligence sharing, and targeting of high-level cartel figures. However, the cartels have proven resilient and adaptable. When leaders are arrested or killed, organizations restructure and continue operations. When trafficking routes are disrupted, new ones are established. The profit margins in methamphetamine trafficking are so enormous that the financial incentive to continue is irresistible. A kilogram of methamphetamine that costs a few $100s to produce in Mexico can be sold for tens of thousands of dollars in the United States, creating wealth that empowers these criminal organizations and fuels violence in Mexico. Public awareness of methamphetamine has been shaped by media coverage, popular culture, and public health campaigns. The television series Breaking Bad, which depicted a high school chemistry teacher who begins manufacturing methamphetamine, brought the issue into mainstream cultural consciousness, though its portrayal of meth production and trafficking was often more dramatic than realistic. Public health campaigns have used graphic images of the physical effects of methamphetamine use, particularly the dramatic before and after photographs showing the rapid physical deterioration of users in an attempt to deter people from trying the drug. The effectiveness of such fear-based approaches is debated among public health experts. Looking at the global picture, methamphetamine and other amphetamine-type stimulants represent a significant and growing portion of the world's drug problem. Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand and Myanmar, has experienced severe methamphetamine epidemics. In Thailand, methamphetamine pills called yaba, meaning crazy medicine, have been widely used, particularly among young people and labourers. Myanmar has become a major production centre, with militias and insurgent groups funding their operations through methamphetamine manufacturing. Australia has seen methamphetamine use, particularly of crystal methamphetamine, or ice, become a major public health crisis. Europe has experienced increasing availability and use of methamphetamine, though amphetamine sulfate has traditionally been more common there. The persistence of the methamphetamine problem, despite decades of enforcement efforts, treatment programs, and public education, highlights the complexity of drug policy and the limitations of the predominantly punitive approach that has characterized much of the response. Some experts argue for a greater emphasis on harm reduction strategies, such as needle exchange programs to prevent disease transmission among people who inject methamphetamine, and expanding access to treatment rather than incarceration for people struggling with addiction. Others maintain that enforcement must remain a central component of any strategy, particularly in targeting the criminal organizations that profit from the drug trade. The story of methamphetamine is ultimately a cautionary tale about unintended consequences and the double-edged nature of powerful technologies. A compound that began as a pharmaceutical advance, something that seemed to offer humanity the ability to transcend natural limitations of energy and endurance, revealed itself to be a destroyer of individuals, families, and communities. Its history encompasses war, organized crime, public health disasters, and human suffering on a massive scale. Yet it also reflects broader themes about human nature, about our desire to alter our consciousness, escape pain, or enhance our capabilities, and about how easily those desires can lead us into destruction. The methamphetamine problem, now more than a century after the drug was first synthesized, remains one of the most challenging public health and criminal justice issues facing nations around the world, with no simple solutions in sight.